It was a cool September evening, and I was home, chopping vegetables, thinking about our weekend plans. Marcy had just stepped out to grab a bottle of wine, and I was caught up in a sense of normalcy, domestic life, kids asleep upstairs, and a kitchen filled with familiar smells. Little did I know, that night would start a series of revelations I could never have anticipated. Marcy had been different lately. She wasn't the warm, animated woman I'd known for over a decade. We had shared so much, or so I thought. She was my rock when I launched my business, the one who made our house feel like home and our family a fortress. But over the last few months, there was a distance I couldn't quite explain. She'd brush me off with an easy smile, say she was tired, or had too much work to catch up on. I'd convinced myself it was just the stress of her new project, something she was deeply invested in. Still, her excuses had started to pile up, and the late-night work trips were more frequent. I could feel my trust in her wavering, a feeling foreign to me, someone who had always seen loyalty as absolute. I wanted to believe it was nothing. In fact, I needed to believe that. That night, as I diced the last of the peppers, Marcy's phone lit up on the counter beside me. She'd left it behind, which was rare. She was practically glued to the thing lately. I caught a glimpse of the message preview. It was short, vague, just 4 words, "I can't wait tomorrow." It was from someone labeled simply as M, a name I didn't recognize. A chill ran through me. I knew it could be nothing, a simple message from a colleague or friend. But after all these months of feeling shut out, I couldn't ignore the unsettling twist in my gut. Trying to shake off the feeling, I put down the knife and went to finish setting the table, deciding to brush it off. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder my thoughts got. Who was M? And why was it all so carefully hidden? I reasoned with myself. Maybe it was innocent, just a friend or a coworker. But Marcy had never mentioned an M, and the fact that it had felt secretive kept nagging at me. I told myself that I wasn't the kind of person who went snooping, that our relationship was built on trust. But when Marcy came back and I looked at her, there was a discomfort I couldn't shake. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe I was overreacting. People have friends and conversations that their spouses don't know about. But this felt different, and I hated the suspicion that was eating at me. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying everything I'd brushed off over the last few months, the odd late nights, the deflected questions, the distance. Finally, my patience wore thin. It was 3 a.m., and sleep was nowhere in sight. I went back downstairs, where Marcy's phone lay on the kitchen counter, charging. I picked it up, my pulse quickening. This wasn't something I'd ever imagined myself doing, and for a second, I almost put it back down. But a part of me was too restless to ignore what felt like a blaring alarm going off in my head. Unlocking her phone was easy. I'd seen her enter her passcode enough times. My hand shook slightly as I opened her messages. The name M was at the top of the list, as if they'd been in constant communication. The first few messages were innocent enough, discussions about work and light-hearted jokes. But as I scrolled up, the tone changed. Their messages grew more personal, intimate, with phrases that had no place in a marriage. My chest tightened as I read each line, each word, feeling as though I'd stumbled into a nightmare. The messages described weekends, hotels, plans to meet. My hands grew cold as I realized the scope of her betrayal. It wasn't just a fling, it was something deeper, something she had invested herself in, perhaps as much as she once invested in us. I kept scrolling, absorbing as much as I could stomach, feeling as though the walls of our home, our supposed safe haven, were closing in on me. There were messages about future plans, promises I had thought she reserved for me, for our family. Each word, each affectionate message, chipped away at the foundation of trust one had built around her. In those moments, the reality of it all struck me. Marcy was living a double life. I put the phone down, feeling a hollowness in my chest. The realization didn't come with the anger I'd expected. Instead, it was a wave of grief, like losing someone I loved, someone I thought I knew. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring into the empty living room, the silence around me broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. But the pieces were there, and I could feel them settling into a clear, undeniable picture. I needed proof, more than just texts. I needed clarity about who this person was and what she was willing to risk for him. The next morning, I called in sick and spent hours combing through our shared bills, tracking down every questionable expense, dinners, hotels, receipts from weekend trips she'd taken alone. I even cross-referenced them with her emails, gathering an arsenal of evidence that left little to the imagination. After that day, everything changed. I played my part, friendly, supportive, the perfect husband. If Marcy noticed anything different, she didn't let on. But I was set on seeing this through, ready to deliver my own form of justice. Marcy had orchestrated this elaborate ruse, a betrayal disguised under the guise of marriage and commitment. She'd torn apart our family, shattered my trust, and I wasn't about to let that go unanswered. If she wanted to keep secrets, then I'd let her. But I would turn her own game against her, waiting for the perfect moment, the right time to confront her, so she'd feel the sting of betrayal in a way she would never forget. The days turned into weeks as I gathered everything I needed. In the weeks that followed, I wore my newfound mask with ease. I became the picture of a supportive husband, involved father, an attentive partner, carefully concealing the truth I had unearthed. I put on a show, blending into the routines and rhythms of family life, waiting for the right moment to reveal what I knew. Every morning I would get up, go to work, and come home, all the while calculating, preparing. It became my personal chess game, each move meticulously planned. Marcy seemed oblivious to the shift. In fact, she seemed relieved, almost happier, as if her secret was safe. She went about her days, planning her work trips and spending extra hours at the gym, her phone clutched in her hand more often than not. At times, the sight of her, laughing with the kids or curled up on the couch with her favorite book, would make me question everything. How had she become such a stranger? And how had I missed it for so long? I'd always been one to avoid confrontation. I hated fights, despised loud arguments. Marcy and I rarely argued, even our disagreements were civil, respectful. But this was different. This betrayal had awakened something inside me, something that had been dormant for years. I wanted her to know the depth of her betrayal. But I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of an outburst or a heated exchange that would quickly burn out. No, I wanted her to feel the slow, creeping realization that her facade was about to crumble. Meanwhile, I took steps to prepare. I contacted a lawyer, someone I'd known from college who handled cases like this with discretion and precision. He guided me through the legal landscape, suggesting ways to protect myself financially and make sure I maintained custody of the kids. I had no idea how ugly this would get, but I knew I needed to be ready. To keep my plan secret, I played it cool. On weekends, I planned outings with Marcy and the kids, trips to the zoo, family dinners, movie nights. I put on my best act, wanting to make sure there was no room for doubt when the truth came out. I wanted her to remember these moments, to feel the weight of what she was throwing away. One Friday evening, about a month into my charade, Marcy mentioned she'd be traveling for work again. This time it was an important client meeting she couldn't miss, and she would be gone for 2 nights. She rattled off the details with a practiced ease, smiling and packing her suitcase as if she were preparing for a weekend getaway with friends. She seemed almost excited, and I couldn't help but feel a bitter taste in my mouth. I kept my face neutral, giving her a supportive nod. Sounds like a big deal. Make sure you wow them, I said, forcing a smile as I helped zip up her bag. She smiled, gave me a quick kiss, and thanked me for understanding. It was maddening how effortlessly the lies rolled off her tongue. But I remained stoic, watching her carefully as she went through her routine, hiding the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. When she left that evening, I followed my own plan. I'd hired a private investigator, a quiet man named Paul, with a reputation for meticulous work and absolute discretion. He would follow Marcy, documenting her movements, taking pictures, tracking where she went and whom she met. It felt surreal, like a scene out of a movie, but I knew I needed this. I needed evidence that went beyond the texts and bank statements, something undeniable. That night, I went through the motions at home, tucking the kids into bed and reading them their favorite stories. I lingered by their beds, thinking about how this was all for them. They deserved stability, a home free from the kind of betrayal Marcy had unleashed. I stayed up late, half watching an old movie, my mind elsewhere, waiting for Paul's report. The next morning, I woke up to find an email waiting in my inbox. Paul had attached a handful of photos and a summary of the previous night. As I scrolled through the images, I felt my pulse quicken. There was Marcy meeting M at a fancy downtown restaurant, the kind she'd once said was reserved for special occasions. I stared at the photo of them sitting close together, laughing, her hand on his arm. The familiarity between them was painful to see. Paul's summary was brief but thorough. They'd had dinner, stayed for drinks, and then walked together to a nearby hotel. The photos continued, a kiss on the street, her leaning into him, then both of them disappearing through the hotel entrance. I shut my laptop, feeling a surge of anger, betrayal, and, strangely, relief. Here it was, the undeniable proof I'd been waiting for. I spent the rest of the weekend going through the motions. The kids noticed Marcy's absence but didn't seem too fazed, they were used to her work trips by now. I kept them busy, taking them to the park, treating them to their favorite ice cream, and all the while planning the next phase of my revelation. I wanted her to see what she'd done, to realize the depth of her betrayal, not in anger but in cold, hard truth. Marcy returned late Sunday night, her suitcase in hand, the familiar look of satisfaction on her face. She dropped her bag in the hallway, took a deep breath, and walked into the living room where I was waiting. She smiled, as if nothing had changed, as if this was just another normal weekend. "Hey," she said, a hint of tiredness in her voice. "How was the weekend?" "It was good," I replied, keeping my tone steady, almost cheerful. "The kids had a great time. We went to the park and caught a movie. They missed you." She smiled, a flicker of something that might have been guilt crossing her face. But it was gone in a second, replaced by the familiar mask she'd worn for months. "I missed them, too," she said. "I'll make it up to them this week." I nodded, feigning acceptance. The moment wasn't right yet, but it would be soon. I would bide my time, wait for the perfect opportunity to lay everything bare. Over the next week, I put my final plans into motion. I printed out the photos, the bank statements, the texts I'd saved. I compiled everything into a file, a record of her lies, her deceit, her betrayal. It was almost surreal, holding that evidence in my hands, seeing the proof of her duplicity laid out so starkly. I didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, there was a sense of cold, detached resolve. On Friday night, I told Marcy I had a surprise for her. I suggested a quiet dinner at home, just the two of us, after the kids went to bed. She seemed pleased, even excited, as if she thought I was planning something romantic. It was ironic, really, how little she suspected. I set the table, dimmed the lights, and poured her favorite wine, playing my part to perfection. She smiled as she took a sip, looking at me with that old, familiar warmth. As we finished dinner, I leaned back, watching her carefully, savoring the moment. I reached under the table, pulling out the file I'd prepared, and placed it in front of her. She looked at it, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tentative. "It's everything, Marcy," I replied evenly. "Every lie, every betrayal, all laid out for you." Her face went pale, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the file. She opened it, her eyes widening as she flipped through the pages, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. The color drained from her cheeks as realization dawned, the weight of her actions settling in. "Why, how did you?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I stayed silent, letting her process it, watching as the truth unraveled her carefully constructed world. It was everything I had planned for, and as I watched her face, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a cold justice I hadn't known I craved. Marcy stared at the file in silence, her fingers trembling as she leafed through each page, each photo. Her face was ashen, her expression shifting from shock to horror to something resembling despair. She looked up at me, searching for some sign of mercy or understanding, but I stayed silent, resolute. This moment wasn't about giving her comfort or answers, it was about confronting her with the truth, the undeniable proof of her betrayal. Why didn't you say something sooner?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if each word drained her. I let her question hang in the air. I wanted her to sit with the weight of it. "Finally," I responded, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Because I needed you to know what it feels like to be betrayed, to be left in the dark while someone you trusted lied to you every day," I said. "I needed you to see exactly what you've been throwing away." She covered her mouth, eyes glistening with tears she struggled to hold back. But for me, those tears felt hollow. They couldn't undo the damage she'd done, couldn't erase the texts, the dinners, the secret weekend she'd shared with another man. Her silence and her tears didn't absolve her. She had shown me who she truly was, and I wasn't going to let her forget it. She tried to regain some composure, smoothing the pages of the file as if she could somehow soften the damning evidence. I don't know what to say. I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "That's not enough, Marcy," I replied, keeping my voice cold. "You had every chance to stop, to tell me the truth. But instead, you lied, over and over again." She swallowed hard, her gaze drifting down to the table. It wasn't supposed to go this far," she stammered, searching for words that could ease the weight of her guilt. "It just happened. I was unhappy, and he made me feel." "Don't," I interrupted sharply, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Don't try to justify it. Don't tell me how he made you feel. Whatever excuses you have, keep them to yourself. I don't need to hear them." She fell silent, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of our breathing. She seemed to struggle with the words, the explanations she wanted to offer but knew would fall flat. I let her sit in that silence, allowed her to feel the gravity of what she had done. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I really am. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her words. A mistake. She thought of this as a mistake, as if it was some minor lapse in judgment. But this wasn't some careless misstep, it was a calculated deception, a betrayal that had unfolded over months, maybe even years. "A mistake is leaving your phone at the restaurant or forgetting an anniversary," I replied. "This was a choice. A choice you made again and again, every time you lied to me, every time you looked me in the eyes and pretended everything was fine." She opened her mouth to respond but quickly shut it, as if realizing the futility of trying to defend herself. I could see the walls of her rationalizations crumbling, each lie she'd told herself collapsing under the weight of my anger, my sense of betrayal. For the first time in a long while, she was speechless. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a controlled steadiness that belied the storm brewing inside me. I paced across the room, needing the physical distance to stop myself from shouting, from letting the anger that had simmered inside me for so long finally explode. But I knew I couldn't give her that satisfaction. I couldn't let her think that she still had that power over me. "I thought we were partners, Marcy," I said, my voice quieter but sharper. "I thought we had something real. But clearly, I was wrong. You didn't just cheat on me, you threw away everything we built together. You threw away our family." She looked down, as though the enormity of her actions was finally sinking in. Her shoulders slumped, and for a brief moment, she looked like a stranger. The woman I had loved, the mother of my children, seemed lost, replaced by this hollow version of herself, a shell that couldn't even find the words to justify her actions. "Please," she said finally, her voice hoarse, "let me try to make it right. Let me at least try to fix this." I shook my head slowly, the weight of my decision settling heavily on me. "There's nothing left to fix, Marcy. You made sure of that." She started to cry then, silent tears streaming down her face, her body racked with the silent sobs of someone who finally realized they had lost everything. But the sight of her tears didn't move me. I had no sympathy left for her, no desire to comfort or console. She had taken that from me when she made the choice to betray everything we had built. I let her cry, waiting until her sobs had quieted, until she was little more than a shell, hollowed out by the weight of her guilt. I wanted her to feel every ounce of regret, every pang of sorrow for what she'd done. But even as I stood there, watching her crumble, I knew I wasn't done. This wasn't just about exposing her, it was about taking control, reclaiming the life she had tried to destroy. "There's more," I said quietly, pulling out another set of papers from my briefcase and laying them in front of her. She looked down at them, confusion flickering in her tear-stained eyes. What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "These are the terms of our divorce," I replied, my tone cold and unyielding. "I'm filing for full custody of the kids. I want the house, and I want to ensure they're with me. You will have visitation rights, but that's it. This isn't just about us anymore, Marcy. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." She looked up at me, shock written across her face, as if the finality of my words had only just registered. For a moment, I saw a flash of something, perhaps anger, perhaps desperation, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a resigned acceptance. She knew she had no ground to stand on, no defense that could undo the damage she had caused. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Don't say anything," I replied, my voice clipped. "You've said enough already." I turned, leaving her alone at the table, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed, a broken figure in the dim light of our kitchen. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the aftermath, didn't need to know how she would cope with the consequences of her choices. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, about taking back control of my life, my family, and my future. I walked out of the room, feeling a strange sense of relief, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally lifted. I knew the road ahead would be challenging, that rebuilding my life without her would be a process fraught with pain and uncertainty. But I also knew, with absolute certainty, that I was doing the right thing. I had reclaimed my dignity, my self-respect, and in that moment, I felt a freedom I hadn't known in years. I went upstairs, checking on the kids, watching them sleep peacefully, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just swept through their home. They were my priority now, the reason I would move forward, the reason I would fight to build a new life out of the wreckage Marcy had left behind. As I closed their bedroom doors and walked back down the hall, I took one last look at the home we had built together. It was a bittersweet moment, a reminder of what we had once shared, and what had ultimately been destroyed. But I felt no sadness, no longing. Instead, I felt a resolve that ran deep, a commitment to move forward, stronger and more determined than ever. The silence of the house wrapped around me as I turned off the lights and went to bed, ready to begin the long road to healing, to rebuilding, and to reclaiming the life I deserved. The weeks after that night were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and quietly navigating my new reality. I moved swiftly, putting distance between us as I finalized the divorce and prepared to start over. Marcy didn't fight me. She signed the papers, packed her things, and left without a word. It was as if the life we'd built together had crumbled to dust, scattering into memories I could barely hold onto. The kids struggled, of course. They asked questions I couldn't answer and mourned a family they didn't understand was lost long before the truth came to light. I did my best to be strong, to reassure them that everything would be okay, even if, deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I went through the motions, determined to be the father they needed. But no matter how hard I tried, a hollow ache remained, a remnant of the life I thought I'd had and the one that could never be restored. A month after Marcy moved out, I took the kids on a trip upstate, hoping the change of scenery would help us all heal. We stayed in a quiet cabin by the lake, far from the noise of the city and the painful memories of what our lives had become. During the day, we went hiking, tried fishing, played cards by the fire. I wanted to give them a taste of normalcy, something to make them feel safe again. On our last day there, as the sun began to set over the lake, I took a walk alone along the shoreline, letting my thoughts drift. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and lake water, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. I thought of the future, of how we'd rebuild, of how I'd give the kids a stable life, free from the hurt Marcy had left behind. I believed that somehow we'd get through this. But when we returned home that evening, everything fell apart. It was late, close to midnight, when I heard a knock on the door. I'd just finished tucking the kids into bed, feeling the calm satisfaction of a long day well spent, when the quiet knock broke through the stillness of the house. I frowned, wondering who could be visiting at such an hour. I opened the door, and there, standing under the dim porch light, was Marcy. Her face was pale, drawn with lines of exhaustion and sorrow I hadn't seen before. She looked thinner, older, as if the weeks since our last encounter had aged her by years. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her hand, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, lost in her own private grief. "What are you doing here, Marcy?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. She looked up, her eyes hollow and empty. "I needed to see you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know where else to go. I crossed my arms, fighting the familiar anger that rose within me. "We've said everything there is to say. There's nothing left between us, Marcy. You made sure of that." She shook her head slowly, almost as if she hadn't heard me. Her hand trembled as she held out the paper. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice cracking. "But I need you to understand." I took the paper reluctantly, feeling the weight of her desperation in the gesture. I unfolded it slowly, my eye scanning the neatly written words, the sentences that started out confident and grew shaky toward the end. It was a letter, a farewell letter. And in those few paragraphs, Marcy poured out everything she had hidden. Her reasons, her regrets, her guilt, and, to my shock, the quiet suffering she'd hidden from me all these years. She spoke of feeling trapped, of burying parts of herself, of being haunted by things she never felt she could share, even with me. Her words were raw, honest in a way I hadn't expected, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage. The last few lines left me cold. I thought I could live with my mistakes, with the person I'd become. But the truth is, I've lost everything that ever mattered, and I don't know how to keep going. I'm so sorry for what I've done, for the pain I've caused you and the kids. Maybe one day you'll forgive me, or at least remember me as the woman you once loved, before all of this. I can't live with what I've done any longer." I felt a chill as I looked up at her, the realization dawning like a heavy weight in my chest. She had come to say goodbye, a final act of atonement, a last chance to unburden herself before stepping into the darkness she couldn't escape. "Marcy," I whispered, the anger fading as something close to pity filled its place. "Please, whatever you're thinking, you don't have to do this." But she shook her head, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "It's too late," she said. "I've lost everything that made life worth living. I betrayed you, I betrayed the kids, and I can't take any of it back. I don't expect you to understand, but I needed you to know." 1,000 emotions churned within me, anger, sadness, pity, regret. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that despite everything, there was a way forward, that she could still be part of our children's lives. But the words felt hollow, meaningless. I had spent months building my own armor, preparing to move on without her. And now, standing before me, was the broken woman I had once loved, stripped bare of all pretense, burdened by a guilt too heavy for her to bear. We stood in silence, two strangers bound by the remnants of a shattered life, both mourning what could never be repaired. I wanted to say something, anything, that could ease her pain, but the words failed me. She gave me a small, sad smile, her eyes filled with a resignation that cut deeper than any anger or accusation could. "Take care of them," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Make sure they know they were loved." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving me standing on the doorstep, clutching the letter with numb fingers. I waited, hoping she would look back, that she would come to her senses and turn around. But she didn't. The sound of her footsteps faded into the night, and I was left alone, the weight of her final words pressing down on me like a leaden shroud. The next morning, the police came to my door. They had found her car by the cliffs a few miles outside of town, parked neatly by the edge. There was no sign of her, only a small purse with her belongings left on the passenger seat, the engine still warm. I listened in stunned silence as the officer relayed the details, his voice softened by a sympathy I didn't want. I could barely hear him, his words merging into a dull hum as I tried to process the impossible truth. Marcy was gone. She had left this world the same way she had left our marriage, quietly, without warning, disappearing into the shadows of her own choices. I thought of her final words, the sadness that had etched itself into her face, and a hollow ache opened within me, a grief I had thought I was immune to. I had wanted justice, retribution, an apology that could never come too late. But this? This was a loss I couldn't prepare for, a sorrow that defied closure or peace. I found myself standing by the lake that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky streaked with shades of red and violet. I tried to find comfort in the quiet beauty of the scene, but all I could feel was the emptiness she had left behind. She was gone, leaving only fragments of memories, a life cut short by regrets and unspoken apologies. And though I wanted to hate her, to resent her for what she'd done, all I felt was a heavy, unrelenting sadness. In the weeks that followed, I went through the motions, hollowed out and adrift. I told the kids as best I could, sparing them the painful details, trying to shield them from the truth. But they sensed it in the silence that had settled over our home, in the empty space where their mother had once been. They asked questions I couldn't answer, looked to me for reassurance I didn't know how to give. And so, life moved on, a fragile, bittersweet existence built on the ruins of what once was. I poured everything I had into my children, determined to give them a sense of stability, a life free from the shadows of the past. But every now and then, in the quiet moments after they had gone to bed, I would find myself drifting back to that night, to the final, haunted look in Marcy's eyes. I had wanted revenge, but in the end, all I was left with was an empty victory, a life fractured by secrets and a loss that would haunt me forever.